On the 10th of September, 1944, Major Brian Urquhart sat alone inside British Airborne Headquarters, leaning over a desk that smelled of paper, ink, and stale cigarette smoke. In front of him were reconnaissance photographs, the kind that looked harmless until you knew what you were searching for. He held a magnifying glass over one frame, then another, and with every slow pass of the lens, his certainty hardened into dread. There, too clear to deny, were German armored vehicles, not burned-out hulks, not abandoned wrecks, operational tanks, parked and dispersed with the casual confidence of units that expected to fight again soon, and not just any formations either. The markings and patterns pointed to elite troops, SS elements, Panzer formations, the kind of units that did not sit still unless they were refitting for the next blow. They were gathered in exactly the place Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery planned to drop tens of thousands of paratroopers in a matter of days. Urquhart had been doing this work long enough to understand a truth that frontline soldiers did not always see. Battles were decided long before the first shot, in rooms like his, with photographs like these, with intercepts and whispers and fragments that only meant something if you assembled them into a picture no one wanted to look at. For weeks, he had studied every intelligence report he could get his hands on. Ultra intercepts, aerial reconnaissance, resistance messages from the Dutch underground, different streams, different voices, different levels of reliability. And yet, they were all telling the same story. Germany was not collapsing in the Netherlands. Germany was recovering, and the recovery was happening right on the landing zones of Operation Market Garden. He stood up so quickly, his chair scraped the floor. He gathered the photographs and moved through corridors where staff officers spoke in confident tones about bold plans and quick victories. He could already feel the resistance he was going to meet, because the war had entered that dangerous phase where optimism became a weapon against reality. Montgomery had spent August of 1944 riding a wave of triumph. Paris had been liberated. The German army was retreating across France. Maps looked clean. Arrows pointed forward. It felt as if victory was not only inevitable, but close enough to schedule. Montgomery wanted to end the war by Christmas, not with a slow grind, not with cautious methodical pressure, but with a single dramatic punch that would crack open the door into Germany itself. The plan was audacious and simple enough to sound like genius. 3 airborne divisions would drop deep into the Netherlands and seize a chain of bridges. British ground forces would then drive along one narrow corridor, link up with the airborne troops in a strict timetable, cross the Rhine at Arnhem, and break into the German heartland. It was the largest airborne operation ever attempted. An armada of transport aircraft and gliders would carry men, guns, radios, and hopes across the sky like a moving city. The timetable was written with ruthless optimism. The ground column would reach key objectives within 2 days. The airborne troops would hold the bridges until armor arrived. A perfect sequence, if nothing went wrong. But intelligence work exists because things always go wrong. Urquhart was young, still in his mid-20s, and that mattered more than it should have. Experience in war is often confused with age, and authority with rank. He had been assigned to British Airborne Corps intelligence before D-Day, and his job was brutally straightforward. Identify threats to airborne operations. Now he had done exactly what he was paid to do, and the threat he found was so large it threatened to swallow the entire operation. The evidence was not vague. It was not rumor. It was the kind of confirmation commanders claimed to crave, until it challenged a plan they had already fallen in love with. He brought the photographs to Lieutenant General Frederick Boy Browning, commander of British Airborne Corps, and laid them out on the desk with the care of a man presenting a verdict. Urquhart pointed to the shapes and shadows that revealed armored strength. He explained what he believed they represented: the 9th SS Panzer Division and the 10th SS Panzer Division, refitting near Arnhem. Elite units with tanks, artillery, and battle-tested crews, exactly where the British 1st Airborne Division would be expected to land, organize, march, and fight. Browning's reaction was painfully casual. He glanced, as if indulging an anxious subordinate, and dismissed the implications with a line that sounded reasonable only if you wanted it to be true. The Germans were beaten, he suggested. These were remnants. They would not matter. Urquhart tried to push back, because he knew what he had seen. Remnants did not look like organized armored formations. Remnants did not sit in refit areas with structure and discipline. Remnants did not align so perfectly with ultra-intercepts and resistance reports. The dismissal spread upward with an ease that felt almost automatic. When Urquhart's warnings filtered into Montgomery's orbit, the response grew colder. Montgomery had already committed himself. He had argued for priority in supplies and air support. He had sold the operation as the move that would end the war sooner and save lives. He was not going to reconsider, because a junior intelligence officer had found something unpleasant in a photograph. Within that machinery of staff work and prestige, Urquhart's concerns were reframed, not as caution, not as responsibility, as pessimism, overcautiousness, a lack of confidence, a failure to understand the big picture. Someone murmured that he might be under nervous strain. In war, that kind of suggestion is poison. If you can label a man as mentally unsteady, you do not have to argue with his evidence. You can simply remove him. Browning ordered Urquhart to take leave for a week. Officially, it sounded like rest. In reality, it was exile. An inconvenient voice was silenced because it threatened a beautiful plan. And Urquhart was not alone in his doubts. Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower had reservations about Market Garden from the beginning. Not because he lacked boldness, Eisenhower understood risk, but because the plan violated principles that even boldness must respect. It relied on a single narrow road for supplies and movement. It demanded perfect timing across long distances. It assumed weather would cooperate. It assumed the enemy would react slowly. It assumed the airborne troops could hold critical points without heavy weapons, even if they were hit hard. Eisenhower's staff had misgivings. General Omar Bradley considered the concept militarily unsound. Lieutenant General Louis Brereton, responsible for Allied airborne forces, questioned the timetable. Air Marshal Arthur Tedder warned about the unpredictability of September weather, but Montgomery insisted. He argued that the enemy was demoralized and fractured, that boldness would collapse what remained of German resistance. He spoke with the certainty of a man who believed opportunity was a doorway that would slam shut if not rushed. He said this was the moment of a lifetime. And Eisenhower, juggling allies, egos, politics, and the fragile unity that held the coalition together, eventually approved. Not purely from military conviction, but because war at that level is never purely military. Montgomery had been complaining that American commanders were claiming too much glory. British newspapers were asking why American forces appeared to surge forward, while British forces seemed to lag. Churchill pressed Eisenhower to give Britain a defining operation. Eisenhower also understood that if Montgomery succeeded, the war might end sooner. If he failed, Montgomery would lose the leverage to claim he knew better than everyone else. Either way, Eisenhower calculated it was worth the gamble. The gamble was built on assumptions, and assumptions are fragile things. The first assumption was that German strength in the Netherlands was weak. The second was that airborne troops could hold bridges for roughly 2 days without armored support. The third was that a ground column could advance more than 60 miles along a single road, through contested territory, on a rigid schedule. Another assumption was that September skies would remain cooperative for repeated drops and resupply. Another was that the Dutch resistance could provide reliable real-time intelligence. Another was that German commanders would respond slowly, confused, and poorly. Each of those assumptions had cracks. Intelligence officers knew it. Some commanders knew it. But Market Garden was not just a plan anymore. It had become a promise. And once a promise is made at the level of national pride, evidence becomes an enemy. On the 17th of September, 1944, in the early afternoon, the sky over southern England filled with aircraft. Transport planes lined up like a moving horizon. Gliders followed, silent and heavy, carrying guns and vehicles like sealed coffins. The airborne armada crossed the channel in waves, and for a brief moment, it looked like the war was being rewritten in real time. Thousands upon thousands of paratroopers prepared to jump into history. The American 101st Airborne would drop near Eindhoven. The American 82nd Airborne would aim for Nijmegen. The British 1st Airborne would seize the bridge at Arnhem, the final prize, the gateway across the Rhine. At first, the operation seemed to validate every confident briefing Montgomery's staff had ever delivered. The weather was fair. Anti-aircraft fire was lighter than feared. Many drops were orderly. Parachutes blossomed across the Dutch sky like pale flowers. Within hours, American troops secured key bridges in the south. Reports flowed back with encouraging words. Staff officers smiled. For a moment, it felt as if the plan truly was working. But Arnhem was different, and the difference was fatal. The British drop zones were farther from their objective than was ideal. Miles away, not a short dash. That meant paratroopers would have to march through enemy territory to reach the bridge, carrying what they could, dependent on radios that might fail and schedules that might slip. And even as British units moved toward Arnhem, the Germans reacted with a speed that shattered Allied assumptions. Field Marshal Walter Model, one of Germany's most capable commanders, happened to be in the Arnhem area when the drops began. He was not far away, close enough that the sight of parachutes was not an abstract report, but a physical reality outside his window. He understood instantly what was happening. This was not a raid. This was an attempt to seize the bridge and break into Germany. Model moved with the urgency of a man who knew that minutes mattered. He contacted SS General Wilhelm Bittrich, commander of the 2nd SS Panzer Corps. The very corps Urquhart had warned about. The 9th and 10th SS Panzer divisions, refitting, reorganizing but still alive, still armed, still dangerous. Bittrich did not hesitate. He issued orders rapidly, directing armor and infantry to block routes, isolate airborne units, and prevent British forces from reaching the bridge. The German response was the sound of reality snapping into place. The enemy was not collapsing. The enemy was adapting. Meanwhile, the British ground force, 30 Corps under Lieutenant General Brian Urquhart, began its advance from the south along the narrow corridor that Market Garden demanded. The attack started with the confidence of a race, but the corridor itself was a trap built into the plan. It was one road, 2 lanes, stretching through flat country bordered by canals and ditches. There was no easy way around it. Any destroyed bridge, any disabled vehicle, any ambush at the wrong moment could stop the entire column like a cork in a bottle. And the Germans, supposedly beaten and demoralized, did what capable enemies always do. They counterattacked, they disrupted, they delayed. The schedule slipped almost immediately. The ground column reached Eindhoven later than planned, and every hour lost in the south was an hour stolen from the men fighting in the north. At Nijmegen, the bridge held longer than expected. American paratroopers fought hard, suffering casualties as they tried to secure the crossing. The delay forced the British armor to wait. Waiting in war is rarely passive. It is a slow surrender of initiative. As the timetable dissolved, the airborne troops at Arnhem moved from holding until relief arrives to surviving until relief arrives. And those are not the same mission. At Arnhem itself, a small force accomplished what the plan demanded, at least briefly. Lieutenant Colonel John Frost led roughly 750 men toward the bridge and reached it on the night the operation began. They took positions on the northern end, occupying buildings and creating a perimeter in the shadow of the structure they were ordered to hold. Their instructions were simple and merciless. Hold until the ground forces arrive in about 2 days. But the ground forces did not come. German armor surrounded Frost's position with steady efficiency. Tanks rolled into firing positions. Artillery found angles. Infantry closed in. The British paratroopers fought with extraordinary discipline. But discipline cannot create ammunition where there is none. For days they held. They fired until magazines ran dry. They treated wounded men with dwindling supplies. They watched buildings burn and kept fighting from the ruins. They listened to the cries of the injured and the dying, and understood, with growing horror, that the relief they had been promised was becoming a myth. Away from the bridge, the rest of the British 1st Airborne Division, thousands of men, became trapped in a shrinking pocket west of Arnhem. German pressure was relentless. Tanks and infantry squeezed the perimeter down, taking ground yard by yard. Communications failed. Units became isolated. Requests for support went unanswered, not because no one cared, but because the operation's assumptions were collapsing in every direction at once. Weather turned hostile. Fog and rain interfered with air support and resupply. Aircraft could not reach the battle area as planned. Drops meant to reinforce the trapped troops became slaughter as German anti-aircraft fire tore into gliders and transports. By the 21st of September, 1944, the situation at Arnhem had moved beyond crisis into catastrophe. Major General Roy Urquhart, commanding the British 1st Airborne Division, looked at the reality and knew his men could not hold much longer. Casualties were horrific. Ammunition was nearly gone. The perimeter had been compressed to a fraction of what it once was. 30 Corps had finally reached the southern bank of the Rhine near Arnhem, but reaching the river was not the same as crossing it, and German forces controlled the vital ground. Frost's men at the bridge, after holding out with a courage that would become legend, were overrun. The bridge remained in German hands. The central objective of Market Garden, the crossing over the Rhine at Arnhem, had failed. The bridge too far was not a dramatic phrase yet. It was a plain description of what had happened. At that moment, the question was no longer whether the operation would succeed. The question was whether anyone could be saved. Montgomery refused to authorize withdrawal when withdrawal might still have preserved more lives. He insisted attacks continue. He claimed reinforcements were coming. Polish paratroopers and additional troops were thrown into the area, landing into chaos, meeting organized German fire. Some of the finest soldiers in the Allied armies were being fed into a battle that had already turned against them, not because they lacked bravery, but because the plan had been built with no margin for error, and the margin had been spent. On the night of the 25th of September, 1944, more than a week after the operation began, the evacuation finally took place. Under darkness, In cold and waterlogged conditions, survivors attempted to cross the Rhine in boats under constant German artillery fire. Some men drowned. Some were hit in the water. Some made it across and collapsed from exhaustion, alive only because night had hidden them for a few hours. Of the roughly 10,000 British and Polish troops engaged around Arnhem, only about 2,400 escaped. Thousands were captured. Many were killed. The British 1st Airborne Division, as a fighting force, was shattered. In the south, American divisions had achieved many of their assigned objectives. They captured bridges. They fought hard. Their casualties were serious. But the scale of disaster was concentrated at Arnhem, the point that mattered most to the stated purpose of the operation. Market Garden's goal was never merely to seize bridges in the south. Its goal was to cross the Rhine and open the road into Germany. That goal failed completely. Afterward, the arguments began, because they always do. Montgomery refused to accept responsibility in any meaningful way. He blamed the weather. He blamed radio problems and communication breakdowns. He blamed delays by 30 Corps. He pointed to partial successes and claimed the operation had been largely successful, almost complete, because some early objectives had been achieved. To anyone who understood what the plan was supposed to accomplish, that logic was infuriating. Calling the operation mostly successful because some bridges were taken was like praising a ship's voyage because it left port on time, even though it never reached its destination. The real story of Market Garden is not that brave men failed. Brave men did what brave men always do. They fought, they endured, they held positions far longer than planners could have reasonably expected. The real story is that sound intelligence was dismissed because it contradicted ambition. Urquhart's warnings were correct. The German armored units were present. Their reaction was swift. The timetable was unrealistic. The road was a choke point. The weather risk was real. The drop zones were too far. The plan depended on everything going right, and war exists to ensure that it does not. What makes the tragedy sharper is the bureaucratic cruelty that preceded it. Urquhart was not punished for being wrong. He was pushed aside for being right at the wrong time. His evidence was reframed as anxiety. His professionalism was treated as weakness. He was sent away while staff officers protected a plan that had already become an instrument of reputation. When he returned from leave, he learned what he already knew in his bones. The tanks in the photographs were not illusions. The SS divisions were not ghosts. The warnings were not pessimism. They were the truth, and the truth had been expensive. And the cost was paid by men who never had the luxury of debating assumptions. British and Polish paratroopers at Arnhem fought with a courage that deserved better planning, better humility, and a commander willing to listen. No amount of bravery can overcome a plan built without flexibility. No heroism can compensate for arrogance at the top. Market Garden should have ended careers. In a rational system, a commander who ignored intelligence, built a schedule with no cushion, underestimated the enemy, and then refused responsibility for failure would be removed. But war is not always rational, and politics rarely rewards admission of error. Churchill could not easily dismiss Britain's most famous general without admitting a catastrophic failure at a moment when national morale mattered. Newspapers could not attack Montgomery without shaking confidence at home. So the disaster was wrapped in the language of noble effort, an heroic near miss, a tragedy of weather and misfortune, rather than a preventable collapse of planning. Yet the pattern was established. Overconfidence, the dismissal of warnings, the refusal to accept blame, and the consequences did not end at Arnhem. The damage seeped into Allied relationships, into trust between commanders, into how independent authority was granted in the future. After Market Garden, Eisenhower never gave Montgomery the same freedom to run a major operation on his own terms. Montgomery still participated in the final drive into Germany, but under closer supervision, with fewer opportunities to gamble the lives of thousands on a timetable that reality could not keep. When the smoke cleared and the stories began to harden into legend, there remained one lesson that would not go away, no matter how skillfully reputations were protected. Intelligence is only useful if commanders are willing to hear it. Urquhart did his duty. He found the threat. He raised the alarm. He brought proof. And he was removed. Not because the evidence was weak, but because the plan was already sacred. That is why Arnhem became more than a battlefield. It became a warning written in blood. Arrogance kills, not in an abstract moral sense, but in a literal operational sense, measured in missing ammunition, delayed columns, drowned soldiers, and shattered divisions. And in the end, it was not the paratroopers who failed Montgomery's plan. It was Montgomery's plan that failed the paratroopers, because it demanded that reality behave, and reality never does.